Welcome to the CEC Report for the 17th of April 2015. I'm Craig Isherwood, and during today's show I want to discuss with you something of a crucial matter of importance. 70 years ago the world said never again to Nazism and fascism and everything that Adolf Hitler represented, but unfortunately today that is not the case. It's come to our attention just this last week that our good friend and collaborator Dr. Natalia Vitrenko and her colleagues are being set up for physical attacks by the security services of the Ukraine. And that's within a Nazi-dominated country at the present time. Dr. Vitrenko is very well known to many of you because you would have seen her, or maybe seen her on our video on our website, giving a video presentation to our last national conference just concluded in March. And I'll be playing some of the excerpts of her presentation during today's show. Dr. Vitrenko is the leader of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine and a former Member of Parliament from 1994 to 2002. She was also a presidential campaign during the 1999 presidential and 2004 presidential campaigns in the Ukraine. And despite being nearly assassinated through a grenade attack in 1999, she went on to win something like 11% of the vote. Dr. Vitrenko has been a very outspoken critic of the current neo-Nazi takeover of Ukraine, and consequently is now being maliciously defamed by the security apparatus within Ukraine as being a pro-separatist, or, in the words of a Ukrainian official down here, a terrorist. On the 1st of April, the security services of Ukraine, that's the organisation that's targeting Dr. Vitrenko, its head, Natalia Vitrenko, confirmed in an interview that the model for his agency is Stefan Bandera's organisation of Ukrainian nationalists, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the OUN-UPA, which is the exact same organisation which collaborated with the Nazis during their invasion of the Soviet Union and carried out its ethnic cleansing of the Polish population of Western Ukraine from 1943. These actual Nazis are now being elevated to the status of Ukrainian independence fighters under new neo-Nazi laws which have just been signed into law this week by the President Poroshenko. These new laws introduce a raft of new Nazi ideas. Let me give you a sense of what they mean with the help of Natalia. Firstly, they pretend to condemn both communist and national socialist totalitarian regimes and prohibit their propaganda and symbols. But the Nazism that is banned is only the symbols of the German Third Reich from 1933 to 1945, thus leaving, for example, today's neo-Nazi Azov battalion in Ukraine free to march under the Wolfsangel symbol, which of course is simply an adaptation of the swastika. Secondly, as soon as these laws are signed, Vitrenko said as a leading political candidate of the opposition, I could get 10 years in prison for saying that I am proud of my grandfather and for my father who served in the Soviet Red Army. And consequently, the Soviet Red Army fought fascism in World War II. She says that these laws violate an array of European conventions of human rights and freedom of expression to which Ukraine adhered when it signed the association agreement with the European Union, as well as Ukraine's own 2000 law on the perpetual commemoration of the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945. Dr. Vitrenko described how it is currently impossible for her, a former Member of Parliament and presidential candidate, to organise politically in the country. She says, I cannot have contact with the population. I'm never allowed to on Ukrainian television channels. I cannot hold a rally because it's immediately taken over by goons who come with sticks, chains and stones and maim people taking part in the rally. Under these new laws, these same new laws just passed on April 9th, all references in public places to any famous past Russian people or events have to be erased. So now billions are now being spent which the Ukraine does not have to spare, to rename parks, streets, libraries and any other public building to erase past Russian memories. Amid the renewal of artillery shelling around Donetsk last Easter weekend, there was nighttime attacks on various statues of Soviet-era figures around the city of Kharkov, and they were torn down. You also can see on Facebook the right sector leader, Dmitry Yarosh, who's also now the Defence Ministry official, posing with images of grenades decorated as Easter eggs and captioned with the call for divine help in, quote, victory in the holy war with the Russian terrorist bands. It's in this climate that last week Dr. Vitrenko's political party was denounced in a new media campaign to target her and frame her as a pro-separatist or a Russian agent, or in other words, in short, a terrorist, all designed to have her assassinated. Already now for 2 days in a row, Ukraine has been shaken by the murders of political opponents of the authorities. One of those was the People's Deputy of Ukraine, Oleg Kalashnikov, and the writer and journalist Oles Bazna. These murders were brutal, provocatory and unquestionably politically motivated. This week, I've expressly written to our Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, charging that, given the close and very public continuing support of the Abbott government has for the US installed and run neo-Nazi dominated government of Ukraine, your government shares responsibility for the lives of all opposition figures who are in danger of opposing the rapidly advancing Nazification of Ukraine. I've requested that, quote, the Australian government and US Foreign Minister do everything necessary within your powers to make sure that no harm comes to Dr. Vitrenko. Now, if you are as outraged as you should be that our Australian government has played an important hand to bringing about a neo-Nazi government in Ukraine and has not condemned it in the least, then you should mobilise and call up your local MP, call Julie Bishop's office and call your Ukrainian embassy and make sure they know your dissatisfaction and disgust. After the break, I would like you to hear from Natalia herself of events in Ukraine up until 2013. This was the period of time when Ukraine was actually looking forward to re-establishing a prosperous future.
Dear conference participants, I am very glad to greet you. You are gathered today in Australia, far away from our Eurasian continent, and you have such a wonderful topic for your conference, which is dedicated to peace. You are discussing new, unique investment projects, the new Silk Road, the land bridge. You believe there will be peace on earth, and you have dedicated your hopes and your aspirations to that goal. This is wonderful, and believe me, this is what all sane people in the world desire. I regret very much that my country, Ukraine, is not a part of this process today. In my country, there is a civil war, and my country is undergoing deliberate, sustained, and brutal destruction. You know, Ukraine not long ago, only 25 years, was among the 10 most developed countries in the world, measured by GDP per capita. Ukraine at that time produced 2% of the world GDP. Per capita, Ukraine's GDP level was 11% above the world average. We had full employment. All our factories were operating. Ukraine had more than 360 major industrial plants. Ukraine was an advanced agro-industrial country. We had rocket-building plants, shipbuilding, aircraft, auto, and locomotive production. Ukraine has over 20% of the world's reserves of black earth soil. We had excellent harvests. Nobody went hungry. We had free education and health care. We could raise our children with full confidence in what tomorrow would bring. Ukraine has existed as an independent country for 24 years. What has that so-called independence brought to my country? Today, Ukraine's GDP represents only 0.5% of world GDP. It was 2%, now it is 0.5%. Expressed per capita, Ukraine's GDP is $4,000 per capita, as against a world average of $10,500 per capita. This is now 60% below the world average. We were 11% above the average level, and now we are 60% below it. 60% below it. Why is this? It is because the economic ties were broken with those factories and regions in tandem with which our economy had developed for decades. First and foremost, that means Russia, Belarus, the other former Soviet republics. In this setting, of course, there has been no improvement of life for the population. The figures tell the story. The average life expectancy in our country has fallen by 2 years during these 25 years. It was 72, now it is 70. Men in Ukraine live to an average age of 62. The population is dying out. Ukraine had a population of 52 million in 1990. Now there are 43 million left without Crimea. Ukraine has lost Crimea. The primary reason for this is the reform policy imposed by the International Monetary Fund. This reform policy meant the privatization of state property, which passed into the hands of a new oligarchy. That oligarchy is getting along quite nicely. Their families do not suffer any poverty. The reform policy ended government regulation of export and import. Commercial banking activity proliferated, and the banking mafia began to make money on Ukraine's problems. The banking mafia, too, is not impoverished. They're living quite well. The IMF reform policy for Ukraine prescribed a cheap labor economic model. The subsistence level, the minimum wage, and pensions were artificially suppressed, and that's why the overwhelming majority of the population is impoverished. According to the Human Rights Ombudsman, in 2011, 80% of the Ukrainian population was living below the poverty line established by the United Nations for Central and Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States countries. That is $4.30 per day in U.S. dollars. 80% of the Ukrainian population received less at that time. What about now? Let me tell you how things are now. Ukraine faced the choice of whether to integrate with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, the customs union, or with the European Union. What needed to be done was to weigh and analyze these different options, and they were analyzed. A special working group was set up, including specialists from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Economic Forecasting Institute, and the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences Economic Forecasting Institute. This working group meticulously calculated what would be more beneficial for Ukraine. Their clear answer was that integration in the East with the member countries of the customs union would be beneficial and promising and could actually save Ukraine. Their calculations showed that if Ukraine joined the customs union, it would experience an 18% increase of GDP in 10 years. This would be the highest increase of any of the customs union members. Russia would have 16.8% growth in that time period, Belarus 16.1%, Kazakhstan 14.7%. But Ukraine would have 18% GDP growth. Why? Because the barriers would be removed for Ukrainian goods to be sold in Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Prices on these products would decline and they would become more competitive because of the lower costs of bringing them to market. Furthermore, Ukraine would have received much needed investment for modernizing its industry. Do you think these were merely projections? No, indeed. Let me give you precise figures. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president of Ukraine. His image was that he was supposedly pro-Russian and would establish close contacts with Russia. In April 2010, the Kharkov Agreement was signed, whereby Russia granted Ukraine a discount on natural gas prices. Everybody really hoped that there would be an intensive economic integration process between Russia and Ukraine. But what happened in 2010 overall? In 2010, Ukraine's trade with Russia grew by 60.7%, reaching the level of $41.9 billion United States dollars. Russian-Ukraine trade increased, and Ukraine obtained a huge market for its products. Ukrainian industrial output rose by 11% in 2010. I'm talking about industrial output, which was the core of the Ukrainian economy. This is why Ukraine's GDP rose by 4% in 2010. It was not only that gross exports to Russia rose, but the composition of Russian imports from Ukraine was 40% high-tech products and 45% products of a medium technology level. In other words, this was creating demand for a highly skilled workforce in Ukraine, so that our children, when they graduated from school, from university, there would be demand for their skills in the economy. 2010 showed that very clearly.
When we come back from the break, we'll find out how Ukraine was betrayed by her president, but how the Ukrainian people would have none of it. Welcome back to the CEC Report. As you just heard from Natalia's presentation, the Ukrainian people had a great deal of optimism towards looking towards the East and Russia for their economic development. When President Yanukovych came in, he came in on the promise that he was indeed to go in that direction. But unfortunately in 2010, he changed face and under obvious pressure from the West decided that he was going to look at integration with the European Union. This was going to create enormous economic cost for Ukraine because effectively joining the association agreement with the European Union was nothing more than a looting mechanism that Russia had experienced around in the late 1990s or in the 1990s. Yanukovych came under enormous pressure. There was a great deal of discussion about the turn to the European Union. A lot of betrayal, of course, was felt. But he's under so much pressure and the cost was going to be so great that by 2013, November of 2013, he had to publicly come out and say that he was no longer going to support the European Union's demands and the West's demands. Immediately that happened, you had the uprising within the Euromaidan, and that you had peaceful demonstrations turn violent whereby neo-Nazi groups came in and literally began killing people. Now, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for the United States, bragged that the United States had spent over $5 billion funding up to 2,000 groups deliberately to make sure that Ukraine went with the European Union. What is at play here is an attack on Russia and the sovereignty of Russia, first and foremost. Russia is a member of the BRICS grouping of countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa that have joined together in a new world economic order for peaceful collaboration and mutual economic development. There's a whole raft of new financial structures that are now challenging the British-dominated transatlantic financial system that's in a process of collapse. Therefore, Russia, as a nation that has never been conquered, has to be contained. And therefore, Ukraine, as a strategic neighbour of Russia, is being used in geopolitical games to create the sort of pressure they believe, the West believes, that can contain Russia. Unfortunately, this will lead to thermonuclear World War III if there is any sort of escalation in the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. So, with this $5 billion paid for by the West, we have now seen the disintegration and the destruction of a sovereign country that used to have, up until 2010, the optimistic outlook for its future development. Despite attempts from the West, like for example the 21st of February 2014 agreement, the February 14th agreement, the 21st agreement as it's called, where Germany, France and Poland got together with Ukraine's leader Yanukovych, and he agreed to resign and held new elections so that the will of the people could be reheard. The fact was that this was completely ignored by the West, and you had the ongoing funding of these violent neo-Nazi groups. These are the neo-Nazi groups. This is the neo-Nazi government now installed that is targeting the life of Natalia Vitrenko. And if we in the West allow this to stand, it means it will happen again, possibly in our own country, and it is happening in our own country. I would like the last few words to be left to Natalia Vitrenko, and you can see her full presentation on our website, and you can get press releases on this subject from our website.
This is what is being done to Ukraine. War, death, hunger, and poverty. What will Europe get out of this? What does Europe stand to gain? Do Europeans really not understand that the flames of war may flare up even more now? And then the seemingly local war in Ukraine will lead to a world war, to a conflict with Russia. Why do this? I hope very much that peaceful initiatives will prevail. I hope very much that this nightmare in Ukraine can be stopped, and that Ukraine will be able to use its tremendous potential, its intellectual, industrial, and scientific capabilities. They still exist. The people are still alive. I hope that Ukraine can turn to building things, and together with Russia and Europe and China, build new land bridges and the new Silk Road and the program to develop the moon, and so on and so forth. That is what I would like to wish for my country and for all mankind.